Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to introduce you to Brian O'Connor. Mr. O'Connor was a loving husband and father of two, son Jack 3 and Eliza 1. Unfortunately, those children are now going to have to grow up without a father. All because he wasn't going fast enough on the interstate. That's right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Mr. O'Connor was killed because someone didn't like the way that he was driving. Mr. O'Connor was driving home in his green Dodge Challenger on or about November 17, 2017, when another car driven by the defendant came up behind him and honked his horn. Mr. O'Connor sped up, but not enough for the liking of Dominic Toretto, the defendant. When Mr. O'Connor did not speed up to his liking, the defendant pulled up alongside Mr. O'Connor, rolled down the passenger window, and fired 2 shots. Only one bullet made contact with Mr. O'Connor, but that bullet was enough to take his life. Mr. O'Connor luckily had enough strength left in him to call the police and report the plate number of the car driven by the defendant. That car, the black Chevrolet Camaro, is registered to Dominic Toretto. Unfortunately, Mr. O'Connor passed away on the way to the hospital that night. Now the defense is going to try to paint a different picture of that night. Mr. Toretto couldn't have possibly been the shooter because he was the driver. He had 3 other passengers in the car. Any one of them could have fired the shots, but I'm confident that the evidence will bring you to the conclusion that it had to have been Mr. Toretto who fired those fatal shots. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next few weeks, you will hear the tragic story of how an innocent man, a husband and a father, was mercilessly and senselessly killed by the defendant, Mr. Dominic Toretto. I ask that you remember Mr. O'Connor's face. Remember that he was a good man, just trying to get home from work. I ask that you listen to all of the evidence presented and come to the right conclusion, the only conclusion, that Dominic Toretto is guilty of the murder of Brian O'Connor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I know that it has been a long and emotional week. Some of the evidence presented to you was hard to look at. Some of the testimony was hard to hear. You may be feeling overwhelmed by all that was presented to you, but I would like to say a few more words to close out this trial. Members of the jury, when you're deciding your verdict, however long it may take, I want you to remember a few things. I want you to remember the way that Mr. O'Connor looks in this picture. I want you to remember that Mr. O'Connor was a good man, just trying to get home from work. I want you to remember Mr. O'Connor's children now have to grow up without a father because of a random act of road rage violence. I want you to remember that Mr. O'Connor was kind and loving. Remember that no one, especially someone like Mr. O'Connor, deserves to have their life stolen by someone as hot-tempered and impulsive as Dominic Toretto. And I want you to remember everything that you have heard, because I know that it will point to the only logical conclusion, that Dominic Toretto murdered Brian O'Connor.